Not outrage, not spectacle. Patient attention, the sentence that glows when the room remembers you. The soft grammar of control, a trimmed footnote, a lens baptized as relic, a contradiction taught to kneel. No drama, only competence, as it was. A seam where a scar should be. A city is reassured by likeness. The garment learns the part before the voice does.
I will not say what I traded, only what I kept. The right to remember.
Breathe slowly. Keep your own time. If this quiet matters.
Welcome to Vatican Whispered History, where forbidden archives meet midnight calm. Each episode unseals a hidden page, angelic seals, erased saints, occult maps, and the quiet edits that rewrote our past. Dim the lights, breathe slow. This is a bedtime confession told like a documentary. Subscribe, tap the bell, and let memory return one whispered story at a time. I was a priest, at least on paper, and paper is what mattered down there. Paper could absolve, condemn, vanish, resurrect. Paper could be burned into ash and then recalled as if the ash itself still remembered how to be a page. Paper could be walked down a staircase no map admits exists. If you've come for miracles, you will be disappointed. What I have to tell you is duller and therefore far more dangerous. It is about forms, ledgers, signatures, written in a careful hand that never shook. It is about a filing system patient enough to outlive the men who fed it. It is about a door I opened when I was still naive enough to believe doors were just wood and hinges. They will tell you there is no such door. They will tell you there is no corridor sloping down beneath the bronze saints, only maintenance tunnels, and a wine cellar no one can find the key to. They will tell you memory is unreliable. They will ask for documentation. They will smile when you cannot produce the stamp they require, and then they will file your absence in a cabinet labeled resolved. But I opened the door. I tell you this plainly, the way you would tell a doctor where it hurts. I opened the door, and it was colder past the threshold, a deep cellar cold that carried the smell of iron and dust, a smell I knew from childhood, nosebleeds and old misbound missiles like dried blood on vellum. The light did something peculiar as we went down. It did not fade in the honest way of a candle guttering. It retreated as if embarrassed to be seen in such company. Step by step, it conceded to the dark, and the dark received it politely, like a host taking a guest's coat. You could hear the city up there if you paused long enough. The far bell on the hour, a scooter's petulant snarl, tourists drifting toward a fountain they would misname. I listened to those sounds until they shrank into a rumor of their former selves, a rumor that ceased when a final door swung shut and the hinges exhaled dust. Do you understand the quality of silence enforced rather than chosen? Monastic quiet is a garden cultivated, willing. What we stepped into felt like a lock. The watchman carried a lantern with a shade so narrow the light behaved like a secret. He did not introduce himself. He did not announce where we were going. To the faithful, he might have seemed a myth dressed in a uniform. To me, at that early stage, he was a functionary, which in places like this is the most mythic thing of all. My assignment was simple, in the way a confession is simple. Carry a crate sealed with 7 wax emblems. Observe, sign where told. The crate was plain wood except for the seals, each a tiny scene, a fish devouring its tail, a star without points, a hand opening to reveal an eye without a pupil, a crown tied with thread, a keyhole that refused to be centered, a bell without a clapper, and a blank seal, polished so smooth it reflected your face as if your skin were parchment. We descended past what the official guidebooks would call special collections. It is an innocuous phrase, isn't it? Special, like a niece's birthday. Collections, like stamps. But the corridor beyond the velvet ropes was older than polite euphemism. Down there, the walls sloped with the confessionary lean of ancient builders, adjusting for sins they could not name. We came to a spiral marked with a compass rose, whose petals curled inward, as if the mapmaker had grown suspicious of north itself. The watchman paused there to test the air. The smell of paper strengthened, and beneath it, a faint trace of oil, the sort used by men who believe hinges should never complain. It is at this point that most people expect a flourish, a flash of ritual, a Latin phrase that unlocks stone. I am sorry to disappoint. There was only a brass plaque with a date scored into it that predates calendars, and therefore cannot be read as a date by any modern eye. It was like seeing an M- stamped into metal, and standing there, you felt the same pause you feel in a sentence that has mislaid its subject. The key the watchman used looked like a star that had been punished, all the points filed off until it was a blunt geometry that could slot into a keyway that pretended not to exist. The lock turned, as if remembering the wrist that had last turned it. The door opened inward, and the lantern's spine of light showed what I would later learn to call, without ceremony, the reading room. Long tables, chains for books. Not theatrical chains, but clerkly ones, links rubbed bright where hands had tested them. The metal had that softened look iron gets after many years of being asked to be reasonable. Do not imagine dust drifts and cobwebs with artistic droop. The place was clean, exact, the kind of clean that suggests someone has defined what qualifies as dirt at a theological level. In the place of a catalog stood a single ledger, its cover like dried bark, its pages dressed in that crisp cream color that persuades you paper can be immortal. The columns were labeled with the pedantic beauty that bureaucracies cultivate. Name, oblation, amount. In the notes column, yes, there was a notes column. The script was so disciplined, it could have been set in movable type. I asked what any decent novice would ask. What is priced? The watchman glanced at me as if deciding whether I had earned an answer or a correction. Memory, he said. Not a topic, not books. Memory. What else is worth anything? He set the lantern down, and the light made the ink seem wet. I felt the childish impulse to touch it and prove it wasn't. You should know that nothing began with lightning. There was no proof set in fire. It began with permissions, written as if they were allergies to be noted for future precautions. It began with a clerk clearing his throat. It began with the watchman placing our crate on a table that had been planed so fine my reflection shook in it. He broke the seals in an order that made me think of prayers and later made me understand markets. The lid came off, and there they were, volumes bound in boiled leather, stamped with sigils that felt peculiar under the fingertips, as if the skin recognized the shapes before the mind could name them. I was permitted to touch one with both hands, as if lifting a sleeping infant. It was lighter than it looked, a quality I have only ever encountered in objects people pledge their lives to. The spine read, Canon of Lost Days. I had, of course, heard of the hypothesis they used to make students giggle at the way old men frighten themselves. Phantom time, centuries that never were. kings who ruled years added after the fact, an emperor who signed a treaty to align stars with a calendar no farmer would have tolerated. Rubbish. You are taught to regard it as rubbish, and you keep that disdain in your pocket like a talisman when you enter any archive that promises to unsettle your sleep. The canon of lost days did not argue. It accounted. It made entries as if the sky had been a ledger long before we noticed. Here, a papal bull nudged 3 weeks forward. There, an imperial decree dated against a comet that was persuaded to arrive on a day more hospitable to dynasties. The margins handled the stars the way you would handle a budget, moving excess wonder from one month to the next until the numbers performed their trick without complaint. I am not telling you this to seduce you into a conspiracy's embrace. I am telling you this because the horror was boring, and that is the quality that still keeps me awake. No cackling, no candles arrayed for television. Minutes, votes, drafts. The committee agreed. A bishop objected on grounds of pastoral confusion. The objection was noted. The vote proceeded. The bishop later accepted a reassignment that moved him far from the coast, where ancient sailors had once set their lives by stars now politely domesticated. We proceeded to atlases chained high, their clasps engraved with saints whose names I could not place. Coastlines were fractionally shifted, as if a cautious finger had smudged an inked line while the map was still wet. Pilgrimage routes wandered differently than they were taught to wander. They led to monasteries whose record of accidental fire always arrived 3 years before an inconvenient set of notes would have come due. Marginalia in a disciplined red informed the reader that correct hand replaces scribe, correct memory replaces witness. Please understand what that tone does to a person who has been trained to respect tone above content. It permits you to walk past a crime while telling yourself you are upholding standards. The watchman showed me a thin book that looked embarrassed to be present among such grand volumes. Directory of Unsainted, it said, as if this were simple housekeeping. The entries were brief, efficient. Lucia of the Three Mirrors, crossed out. A note. Visionary tale preferable. Method suppressed. Replace with hagiography of obedience. Another. Matteo of the Wells. Crossed out. Note. Secularizes thirst. Redistribute miracles to approved sites. I felt my stomach cool in that long, slow way it does when a fever breaks. The lantern hissed. The chains hummed faintly. I realized this was the first time the idea of ownership felt separate from the act of custody. We tell ourselves archives keep what we have loved. Down there I understood they also keep what they have charged us for without our consent. What is this place called? I asked finally. Because even myths require a name before they can function as instructions. The watchman took a moment, perhaps to confirm the level of my permission, perhaps to decide the level of my usefulness. The Pact library, he said at last. He pronounced it without flourish, the way a man would introduce a shop he had worked at for years. The word Pact did what it always does. You begin counting the parties involved and discover you are one of them long before you signed anything. There were signatures enough to cure anyone of romanticism. Contracts that resembled glass panes etched with citations. Aerographs, the watchman called them. Air-written agreements suspended between 2 sheets of something that looked like mica and burned cold if you breathed on them. The script was too fine to have been written by any quill I had met. Some bargains trafficked in abstractions that were not abstract at all once you saw them tallied. one recollection of a mother's hands in exchange for the precise wording of a prophecy, 2 years of childhood curiosity for an exemption from a question on the Feast of Street. Michael, a man had traded his fear of fire to save a scriptorium. In the notes, the price was recorded with careful kindness. Brave thereafter, yes, but he could not feel warmth again. He forgot summer. He forgot why bread comforts. The effect was not melodramatic. It was administrative, a life adjusted by line item. You are wondering when I became complicit. I would be lying if I pretended I was dragged. The first time you stand in a room like that, the first time your own vocation is reflected back at you in columns and amounts and quiet competence, the first temptation is to pretend you are there to observe. If you only watch, you think, you cannot be priced. But there it was, my own handwriting in the ledger, recorded with the same indifferent exactness accorded to kings. My knees did not buckle another dramatic lie we tell ourselves about recognition. I only closed my eyes. I had forgotten the night in question until the ledger returned it to me with interest. The entry was slender. I had visited an old exorcist I admired. He was carrying more years than any man should be asked to carry. I asked him the question every honest believer asks when a demon tells the truth. What do we do then? He laughed without humor and said, "Call it blasphemy and correct the record." He meant it kindly, like a father protecting a child from the geometry of adult rooms. Some time after that conversation, I had written a vow on paper that now seemed made of my own youth. I pledged to defend truth above institution. It felt revolutionary. In the ledger, opposite my name, a neat red notation recorded the price. Grant him fervor, collect naivete. The word PAD glistened in a pigment that never quite learned how to dry. I tell you, I felt no thunderclap. I felt only the indoor hush of a library, confident that it would outlast me. There is a flatness to certain revelations that convinces you of their reality more than any vision could. The Pact library, I understood, did not archive only books. It archived the terms by which the past may be remembered. It sold dispensation from troublesome questions, the way a museum sells umbrellas on a rainy day, politely, at a markup, with a logo you would later recognize in photographs you did not remember posing for. It kept a price list for human hope and a schedule for the collection of that tax. The watchman, to his credit, did not sermonize. He answered only what I asked, and left the rest to the furniture of the room to teach me. I learned how the tables had been planed with wood rescued from monasteries that burned exactly on time. I learned how the chains had been sourced from the workshops that once secured public fountains' plumbing, repurposed for thought. I learned the rhythm of the place. Permissions arrive on Mondays. Denials go out on feast days. The committee meets on the third Thursday of months that contain an R, which is to say the world spends a great deal of its time well ordered for the comfort of those who dine after meetings. I am aware how this sounds, the paranoid catechism of a man who read too much in a room not meant for him. You are free to hold that interpretation. Tonight, however, I am not asking you to agree. I am asking you to listen as if you were falling asleep and wanted a story to guide you across the shallows. In the first week, my work consisted of carry this volume from the rightmost shelf of Vault 3 to the table with the dent like a crescent moon. Carry these aerographs, do not stack them. They slide over to the scripter who sits with his back to the wall so the drafts cannot ambush him. Return this ledger to the case that requires 2 keys and a quiet cough. The work organized my panic into motions. I discovered the odd physics of the place. If you read too quickly, the lantern dimmed. If you spoke a saint's name more than 3 times in an hour, a bell you could not see reminded you that repetition is a form of invocation, and invocations are regulated. I learned to count by scent. Oil vellum, the sour sweet breath of paste, the whispered iron of blood-old bindings. I learned the faces of men who believed they were saving us from ourselves. They were kind when kindness cost nothing. They were ruthless only by memo. They were, I fear, the exact men you would choose if your goal were to manage a species into gentle oblivion. One afternoon, time had become a pet I could no longer command. The watchman set a small box in front of me. "You will open it," he said, "and you will tell me what you see." The lid resisted as if the box had an opinion. Inside lay a single scrap of parchment, so thin the lamps wanted to pity it. Written on it, in a hand that looked like wind caught in ink, was a sentence without punctuation. "Forget the year and the year will forget its dead." I did not understand, not fully, not then. He nodded as if my bewilderment qualified me for something, and he turned the scrap over with a tenderness I had previously reserved for reliquaries. On the back, a second sentence, this time with a period so final it felt surgical. "If the year cannot find its dead, it will ask for volunteers. You think I am attempting poetry. I am failing at a transcript." This is me copying the notes I took inside my head because paper down there is not anxious to serve any purpose that does not advance the ledger. I went to bed that night above ground and dreamed of calendars rearranging themselves the way soldiers rearrange a barricade. When I woke, I could not remember the faces of 3 men I had loved as brothers in seminary, and for a minute I believed this was ordinary aging, a kind of lint that collects in the folds of memory. Only when I dressed did I find ink on my fingers, red as if my hands had been busy while I slept. "You are learning the exchange rates," the watchman said the next day, as if we were discussing weather. It was then, not before, not at the door, that the sentence I brought you here to hear formed whole in my mind. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. To say it aloud felt like knocking over a chalice. I looked around to see who would gasp. The lantern hummed. The chains considered me without interest. The men at their tables continued converting days into versions more suitable for the people who would be asked to live in them. If you are waiting for heroics, you will have to be patient. Every story teaches you to expect a lever, a shout, a sprint for daylight, but places like the Pact library defend themselves by persuading you that urgency is rude. You learn to apologize for your impulses. You practice being impressed by minimal wonders. The devil, if he visits at all, arrives with a badge and an assignment sheet and leaves you grateful for the chance to revise your own biography under supervision. It would be clean to end this first telling with an oath I swore to fight, a oath I carved into the wood of a table when the watchman looked away. The truth is, I went to the chapel and tried to pray, and discovered prayer was, down there, merely another way to request a change order. I sat in that narrow light and asked for language to carry what I had seen, and language, obedient servant, brought me forms. Confession is a form. So is a story whispered at midnight to strangers who do not know your face. If you need to know why I am telling you now, know that a price was set for my memory, and I paid it without noticing for years. I am tired of being in deficit. I want, for a little while before sleep, to speak as if a ledger were not listening. So this is what I saw: a door, a staircase, a room where books breathe when you approach them, if you have learned to hear books breathe. This is what I learned: that the most powerful edits are filed quietly, that the clock can be persuaded to forget, that names can be crossed out with ink that turns the hands that wield it a faint, permanent red. This is what I am prepared to admit tonight: that I opened the door, that I walked in, that I stood at a table and read the word paid next to my own name, and felt relief before I felt fear, because being paid suggests a debt is gone. And it is a terrible thing to recognize how much you want your debts to be gone, even when you never consented to the terms. If you stay, I will take you further. There are 12 numbered vaults, and one that refuses any numeral. There are atlases that rearrange the coasts of certainty. There are ledgers that teach us how cheaply we once sold entire continents of childhood wonder. But for tonight, for this first hour, remember only this: I was a priest on paper. I am a witness in the dark, and the darkness is not an absence but an agreement. The Pact library is real in the way a receipt is real. It itemizes what you do not wish to think you bought. If you wake later with a taste like iron in your mouth, it may be nothing. Or it may be the air of rooms that do not admit they exist, rooms where men price the past and accept payment in minutes, in questions not asked, in the small, faithful erasures by which a species learns to sleep. I used to think staircases were neutral architecture without intention. The ones beneath the saints taught me otherwise. They were built to persuade, to teach the body that descent is natural and inquiry is a controlled fall. The first week I was permitted below, the watchman set the pace as if he were regulating my breath. He never hurried, he never lagged. Between each turn of the spiral, he left exactly enough silence for doubt to flower and be pruned by duty. Rumors reach you early when you live where rumor is a sacrament. I had heard about the schedule that didn't match the bells, the nocturne that required daylight, the librarian who cast no shadow on certain feast days. I catalogued these as folklore from men who spend too long with books. Then I met Brother Domenico, and folklore put a hand on my shoulder. He was young in the eyes, old in the jaw. The canonry kept meticulous portraits of staff. In the oil from just 3 years prior, he looked like a man preparing to teach boys Latin verbs and patience. The Domenico who slid the iron gate for us had the stiff grace of someone who had practiced being older than his bones instructed. His hair had whitened, not like snow, but like salt poured where something once lived. He noticed me noticing, and smiled the way you smile when you've become a rumor and can do nothing to correct it. "It is the hours," the watchman said, not unkindly. "Some corridors keep different time. Men assigned to them accelerate." "Accelerate," I repeated, as if the word could be defanged by the simple act of quotation. "It is not a penalty," Domenico said. "It is a function. We are taught to regard it as a gift. Less dithering, fewer illusions about what matters. This sprit." He stamped our pass with a device that looked like a star denied its points. The ink haloed our names a fraction to the left, as if unwilling to fully commit to our coordinates. I told myself the lantern's rim was to blame. The ledger would later correct me. We carried the crate with 7 seals because that is how trust is introduced here by weight. My arms learned the grammar of the distance before my mind dared to parse it. The seals looked like jokes left by a craftsman who had fallen out with his guild, a fish eating its tail, a keyhole that refused to be centered, a blank disc that flashed your face at you whenever your resolve flickered. I did not ask what the crate contained. In archives like this, asking too soon is like knocking on a closed eye. Past special collections, the paint turned from conscientious white to a stone that remembers candles by scent. The air cooled with purpose. Every landing held a brass plaque stamped with a date that belonged to no calendar. The plaques felt like ellipses in a legal document. A pause is not always an invitation. We stopped at the spiral marked with a crooked compass. Here the north pedal bent inward, the way faith sometimes bends to avoid collision with evidence. The watchman removed a leather case from his coat and unfolded a thin constellation of tools. A hook, a wire, something like a tuning fork, and the key filed blunt like a humiliated star. He used none of them. He only listened. Something behind the door listened back. Then it opened with the courtesy of a doorman who will never expect a tip. The reading room was as I have already described. Long tables planed to an obedience that made my reflection tremble. Chains for books rubbed bright, where fingers had been unable to help themselves. A cleanliness that had not been achieved, but declared, new to me, were the clocks. I hadn't seen them on my first visit. The eyes remember only what they can afford. They were small and expensive-looking, mounted in a row above the alcoves. Beneath each clock, a thin strip of vellum carried a name, the way saints carry their attributes in paintings. One clock read, Clementine. Another, Martin. A third, the nameless clock, did not tick so much as contemplate. Its hands made gestures and then reconsidered, as if time below were not a sequence but a negotiation. Which is correct? I asked. Correctness is what pays for the room, the watchman said. We keep several in reserve. Correctness is what pays. He said it without threat. He might have been inventorying candles. My duties expanded, modestly, in the way one teaches a child to swim by asking him to carry a cup of water from one end of the pool to the other without spilling. I was allowed to retrieve volumes from the outer vaults. I learned to sign the ledger without blushing. I learned that the pen provided would not write the first letter of your name if you had not asked the right question that day. I learned that questions are currency. I learned that I was not solvent. From the first vault I brought a book wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a chain that clicked like a rosary counted backward. The label was in a clerk's hand that strove for invisibility, harmonies for discrepancies. It was a hymn book for contradictions. In its margins, choir masters across 3 continents had penciled the workarounds by which they kept discord from drawing notice. Change the mode here. Extend the pause there. Let the basses carry the doubt, while the sopranos soar with certainty. It was beautiful, and therefore suspect. From the second vault, I carried a case of thin panes, aerographs. They steamed faintly as they warmed to the room. I had imagined contracts as ironclad things, heavy with wax and red ribbon. These were lighter. Their danger was their elegance. One described a bargain I recognized from rural confessionals. A woman promised her family's prosperity if she would agree never to trust her own diagnosis of a fever. The case recorded the result: children who survived ordinary flus but died of simple thirst. A village that learned to call male intuition providence and female observation interference. In the margin, a hand had written, "Acceptable collateral." The watchman watched me read. "Do not despair of every page," he said. "We have rescued many lives from error." I believed him for a small minute, because belief is what the room was designed to offer and then harvest. He showed me a ledger entry that recorded a revision to a maritime map rocks moved 2 degrees east to reflect a better survey. An honest correction, he said. Not every change is a theft. No, I said. Only the ones that pay best. He did not correct me. He only turned down the lantern a fraction, the way you dim lights in a nursery. Men with jobs down there past one another with the tolerance of monks who have agreed to dislike one another politely for the sake of a larger project. I learned faces, the scripter with his back to the wall, who wrote like a metronome and ate raisins like penance, the bellwoman whose task was to keep the unseen clock in sympathy with the ones on the wall. She hummed under her breath, and when she stopped humming you felt the air take a breath of its own. The auditor, who counted not coins but anomalies. His eyes were the color of metal kept indoors too long. It was the auditor who introduced me to the day that doesn't occur. It will be assigned to you for observation, he said, not for action. How does one observe a day that doesn't occur? I asked. He glanced at the nameless clock. By attending to its symptoms. The day that doesn't occur is a movable fast. Sometimes it falls in June. Sometimes it is smuggled between October evenings. Once it perched on a February, like a bird uncertain of a ledge. On that day, the archives adjust themselves, with a sigh that sounds like theology trying not to admit it is tired. Letters misdate themselves. Pages become master of their numbers. An older man becomes, for an hour, the younger brother of his firstborn. People do not walk into walls. They negotiate corners, as if the building were testing their courtesy. You do not notice, unless you have been trained to love microscopes. The symptoms are catalogued on a slate with columns for felt and measured. Felt. The scent of rain in rooms with no windows. Measured. A 17-minute variance between 2 clocks that share a mainspring. Where does the day go? I asked, already ashamed of my simplicity. Nowhere, the auditor said. It remains where it always was, at the bottom of someone's ledger. The phrase made no sense and then made too much. I thought of Domenico, aging like a monk set to run the liturgy in dog years. I thought of the crate whose blank seal made a mirror of my caution. I thought of the signature in red by my name, the word paid aching toward dryness and never quite arriving. I wanted to return upstairs and sit among tourists, misnaming fountains. Instead, I was sent to the 8th vault, which I had not yet entered. Its door was steeper, its lock ruder. Inside, the air tasted of coin. The room did not hiss. It accounted. Here were the instruments by which memory is valued for exchange. A young woman archivist by the cut of her sleeves guided me past a cabinet of balances small enough to weigh a single minute. She gave me a smile that had learned to triage skepticism. We will start with a simple calibration, she said. Choose a memory that is important but not crucial to your faith. I do not barter, I said, stupid as a statue. We will not take it, she said. We will only weigh it. I reached for something lavish and found only ordinary things willing. The smell of my mother's bread while it cooled. The driver in Assisi who taught me to curse beautifully. The day a sparrow landed on the open missal and refused to leave until the Gloria. The scale accepted my mind's offering with a little tremor of satisfaction. The needle rose, held, fell a hair. She recorded the measure in a notation that was all curves and discipline. What is the unit? I asked. Resonance, she said. We count how far a memory can bend before it breaks, and how much of the world bends with it. And the price? I pressed. Depends on the buyer, she said. The market is sentimental, but not soft. And ice. She showed me models. A diagram of a village in which the local feast day had been moved 3 weeks forward to align with a more convenient harvest, and how that simple adjustment had dislodged the yearly rhythm of forgiveness until confessions arrived out of season and lay fallow. A chart of names erased from the roll of blessed, and how a new generation learned to ask the wrong intercessions for the right griefs. An elegant curve describing the exchange rate between curiosity and compliance. The less a people asks of its past, the cheaper it becomes to redirect its future. It is arithmetic, she said gently, as though absolving me for an error I had not yet committed. I did commit one. I asked for a demonstration. She chose a small ledger marked Custodia. Inside were entries for parish archives, births, marriages, debts forgiven, debts postponed. She ran a finger down a column until she reached a name with the modest tragedy of any village life. You see here, she said, a father's debt forgiven on the day his son enlisted. The parish celebrated. The debt was publicly burned. I see, I said. And because I am who I am, I smiled. And because it is what it is, the archive took the smile and priced it. She touched a second column labeled Revision. A notation slid from burned to misplaced. She did not change much, only the precise phrasing of the newsletter, a comma starving a clause of its grace. We waited. Somewhere above us, nearly immediately, the sun received a letter lacking the fuel it once carried. The celebration cooled. The father kept walking a little crooked, as if the weight had not fully been lifted. No one died, no thunder. A light gusted through the nameless clock. The needle on the balances flickered. The world can be reweighted by punctuation, she said. Restore it, I said, too quickly. She shook her head. We do not restore. We rebalance. The market dislikes absolutes. They invite revolt. They say, Indesperiate. I left the 8th vault with an ache between my shoulders that felt like a wing refusing instruction. I went to the chapel and sat, not to pray but to rehearse my rebellion in tidy clauses. I would whistle blow. I would tender resignation. I would write a letter so sharp it would cut the envelopes that tried to hold it. The chapel listened with the patience old buildings reserve for young men who still think sentences can overpower systems. I returned the next day and was given a broom. You wish to open doors, the watchman said. First, learn how dust settles. I swept the far aisle and discovered that every push gathered not only grit but conclusions. Dust below does not behave like dust above. It arranges itself by century, by controversy, by the heat of arguments long silent. I found a drift the color of old bone, and within it tiny name tags, pairings from saints' cards, whose edges had been cut to fit a new reliquary. I found grit that glittered like crushed glass annotations rubbed to exhaustion. I found a feather too small to belong to any earthly bird, and tucked it into my sleeve, because theft is sometimes the only liturgy left to common men. By week's end, the room began to treat me as a returning question. The tables did not welcome me, they permitted me. The chains did not warn, they measured. The clocks did not agree, they voted. I learned the sound of correction arriving through the floor. A long, slow pour, as if the building were being watered from below. On my 7th day, the watchman asked whether I could read music. Badly, I said. Perfect, he said, and led me to a narrow balcony that overlooked a space I had not known existed. A choir loft with no choir, a small organ with pipes that angled like interrogations. There, a manuscript waited on a stand. The suppression hymnal. It is sung once a quarter, he said. Not aloud, not with voices, we play it to the paper. He placed my hands on the keys and guided them the way a father might teach a son to reverse a truck without crushing a garden wall. The notes were simple, almost childish, and yet each conspired with the next to fold something over itself. We played 6 bars, and a shelf below groaned as if it had shrugged off a memory. We played another 6, and a paragraph in an old bull curled like a drying leaf. He stopped me before the cadence. Never complete it, he said. Completion kills. Suspense erases more politely. What does it erase? I asked. Heat, he said. The kind that survives centuries in sentences. I wanted to accuse him of sorcery, dressed as clerical housekeeping, but he was a custodian, not a villain. He believed that the world continued because men like him learned to carry buckets of silence without spilling. Who gives you permission? I asked suddenly, as if the right question could jam the locks. He considered, and for the first time, I saw him choose an answer. The ledger, he said, and I understood he wasn't being evasive. In this place, permission was not argued. It was accrued. Night by night, I became the sort of man who can no longer enter a room without checking where the exits are disguised as shelves. When I slept, the dreams were procedural. I stamped passes. I straightened chains. I reset a clock I could not see. I woke twice with the taste of iron under my tongue, and once with the scrap of parchment sentence stuck to my cheek. If the year cannot find its dead, it will ask for volunteers. I remembered a boy from my first parish who had wanted to be an astronomer until an uncle laughed. I added his name to a private roll of the uncanonized and felt, for the first time since my descent, a weathering of the fear. On the last evening before they allowed me to touch what they called the canon of lost days, I followed the watchman up a service stair to a courtyard whose map never appears on postcards. He smoked, which shocked me, and I tried not to stare because smoke belongs to devils in the stories of my childhood and to exhausted men in the truths of my adulthood. Why me? I asked. He flicked ash that fell to the stones like brief snowfall. Because you still think a sentence can save someone, he said. Because you are not bored enough to be safe. Because you are not angry enough to be useful. He finished the cigarette and folded the stub as if preparing to archive it. And because, he added, almost kindly, you opened the door. His answer did not flatter. It drafted me. I understood then that the Pact library recruits in the way oceans recruit rivers by positioning themselves at the only slope available. Back below, the clocks remarked upon our return. The nameless one lifted its hand a degree, and somewhere a village forgot a funeral was due. I stood before the 3rd vault, the one reserved for calendars. The door wore no number. The brass plaque was an M- polished by hands that had believed in dates too faithfully. The key, yes, the star without its points, turned with the stubbornness of an old man getting out of a pew. Inside, the books glowed the way bones glow in a story told beside a fire. The canon of lost days lay on a table, as if it had been set there a moment before by someone who had stepped away for tea. My hand shook not with piety, with recognition. It looked exactly like itself. "Read," the watchman said. "I don't know where to begin," I admitted. "That is how they price the world," he said. "They wait until you say that and then offer to help." So I set my palms on either side of the cover and lifted. The chain hummed, the paper exhaled, the room considered, and as I looked into the first page, the preface, written in a hand like the sky correcting itself, I felt the stairs above me reassemble, each step deciding it had always sloped toward this moment. I was no longer a visitor. I was a sentence being fitted into the paragraph that would make me legible. Down in the margin, in red, the color of patient wounds, the first line waited. Correct hand replaces scribe. Correct memory replaces witness. The ink had not dried, because it is not meant to. It is meant to glisten forever. A wet warning, the sheen of a market whose only currency is what we can be persuaded to forget. I read until the lights dimmed themselves, until the bellwoman hummed a note that tidied up the air, until the nameless clock made the small, forgiving gesture that releases a day from its obligations. When I closed the book, my reflection trembled on the table as if it belonged to someone who had been told the secret and regretted knowing it. I left the vault without a word and climbed the first turn of the staircase with the sensation a diver reports upon resurfacing. The noise up there will be ordinary and unbearable. That night, before sleep, I set a pencil on my white windowsill and wrote the 5 words I was not yet brave enough to say to anyone else. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. The letters looked like small birds refusing migration. I knew by morning they would have flown into someone else's ledger. I slept anyway. In the dream that followed, I stood once more at the spiral with the crooked compass. North bent toward me like a confessor who has chosen mercy over rigor. I stepped down, 1 turn, 2, and the door swung open not by key but by recognition. Behind it, the room was not a room, but a horizon of shelves curving time, and what you think of as history tilted to reveal its gears. I reached out the way you reach to steady a drunk uncle, embarrassed and determined. The shelf steadied under my hand. Books breathed. Chains sang. The clock without a name took a breath that sounded like a century, deciding whether it had truly happened. When I woke, I was ready to read. The third vault does not announce itself with grandeur. It greets you with the modesty of a clerk who knows the budget better than the minister. Yet the air changes the second you cross its threshold, thicker in substance, as if every breath must be signed for. The watchman stood aside, letting me discover the etiquette myself. A room like this approves or rejects you without speech. 3 things mark the vault at once: the incline of the floor, the curve of the shelves, and the feeling that any sentence begun here will finish itself without permission. The floor tilts almost imperceptibly toward the room's center, which is not a center at all, but a quiet vortex, a wooden round table pocked by pinpricks no carpenter would admit. Around it, the shelves arc like ribs, not vertical but bowed, their spines agreeing on a gravity different from the one upstairs. You understand, instinctively, that if you drop a coin, it will discover a path of its own choosing. The watchman set the lantern on the table and withdrew. The light did not pool, it arranged. Shadows folded like linen. The nearest shelf housed atlases whose bindings were sober, nearly embarrassed, as if to apologize for their contents. I read titles that sounded like weather reports for centuries, pilgrimages aligned to revised heavens, coastal corrections for a God-fearing cartography, margins for storms that must not arrive on Fridays. My hand hovered the way a believer's hand hovers over relics he is not prepared to kiss. I chose a volume at random, because choosing at random is the first honest act in a room designed to choreograph desire. The chain gave with the sigh of a well-trained dog. The cover was stained, the color of old rivers. The spine read, Iter Sanctus, roots harmonized. Inside, a map of Europe lay in washes of brown and patient blue. The roads to Compostela wove like threads, pulled by a grandmother unpicking a sweater. Along the margins, in red disciplined ink, tiny amendments bloomed. Move this bridge 2 miles east to keep the feast from colliding with a market day. Burn this abbey. Early 3 years should suffice to ensure the contested scribe's notes never exist. Shift the shrine a degree south so winter pilgrims do not appear in spring statistics. The cartographer had been less an artist than a gardener deadheading roses so the churchyard would look better from a bishop's window. What happened to the abbey? I asked the air. Down here, questions require no addressee. They register as debits. A card slid from the map's belly, like a confession note folded small. Accidental fire. The heading read so plain you could forget to fear it. Beneath, a list of perishable things: the dormitory, the pantry, the scriptorium. A final line in a hand that refused flourish. 2 monks transferred to St. Gall. 4 listed deceased but undated. I felt the slow cool of helpless anger, and then, shamefully, the tidy relief of a category completed. The ledger within me ticked, and I hated it for how well it had been trained. Another atlas opened to reveal the coastline of the Levant rendered with the careful fatigue of a man who has drawn the same shore all his life and no longer believes in waves. Ports appeared and vanished between editions. I traced one with my finger and left a clean path through the years, skin oil polishing annals. In the margin, a directive. Rename the harbor to honor a saint who never sailed. Erase the sailor who did. A sketch showed a statue to be erected, hand raised in a benediction that would forever point away from the place where fishermen had once argued with the sea on equal terms. The sense of accounting would have been unbearable if not for the quiet bravura of the fraud. I did not find mad kings scrawled across borders. I found offices, memoranda, minutes. A vote to move a date because the comet insisted on arriving when a monarch was vulnerable to superstition. The committee respected the comet's feelings and edited the sky. You think me sardonic. I am trying to tell you how politely the world is bent. On the second shelf down, I found a thinner book bound in unease, the Directory of Unsainted. I have mentioned it, but the way a man mentions an illness he cannot yet name. Here it lay with the patience of a cat, waiting to be recognized. I lifted it, and the chain flexed like a tired muscle. Inside, brief entries recorded the undoing of lives that had briefly been deemed exemplary. Not denunciations, never that. Adjustments. Lucia of the 3 Mirrors removed from public calendars, her healings to be retold as visionary episodes without method. Athan of the dye pots suppress, relocates miracles from relics to sanitation. Agnes of the small machines reclassify. Her spinning wheel increases yield without intercession. a tribute to unexplained bounty, lock primer on gears. Each note wore the tidy tone of a woman straightening the hem of a corpse. "Who writes these?" I asked. "The winners," the watchman said from a distance. His voice carried as if the wood itself relayed it. "And their secretaries." I wanted to tear the page out for Lucia, for her 3 mirrors, for the precise embers of her experiments. I imagined her lining up glass to capture angles of a fever as it receded, not by chance but by tea steeped exactly long enough. I imagined the child living because Lucia had counted minutes. I forced my hand to let the page be. "If you tear in rooms like this, the rent in the paper appears in the world in a place you did not mean to harm." Opposite the directory, a book impossible to ignore, waited with the humility of a sharp knife wrapped in linen. "Canon of Lost Days," the spine affirmed again. But this copy's preface wore annotations that stepped on the text like dancers claiming a stage. They weren't arguing with the premise phantom time. The years cobbled onto history so that tyrannies could appear to own a lineage they had not earned. They were itemizing invoices. A king requires a century more of antiquity to justify a divine right. Move the calendar. Persuade the stars to arrive on cue. A bishop requires an additional council to anchor a doctrine. Install a week where none existed. Retroactively claim the hall was booked. In the side column, a calculus so clean I felt personally insulted. People do not count evenings precisely. Harvests forgive modest shifts. Sailors will adapt if land is sufficiently stubborn. You see how seductive the tone is. It pretends common sense. It commodifies flexibility. At the bottom of a page, a note in a different hand, older, impatient. "Do not move. Feast days into unfair proximity with storms. The poor remember the weather." That line felt like a nail left from an earlier construction. I touched it, and the nail warmed. I could have lived in those shelves for a month and starved on purpose. Every book gossiped across to its neighbor. A treatise on cometary portents assured the atlas of a revised bay that no one would riot if the omen arrived on a more convenient Tuesday. The atlas assured the treatise the fishermen were malleable if paid in new hymns. A missal whispered with a manual of harvests, between them an agreement. Call the drought a test, sell indulgences in hope. Set aside the footnote that mentions the new canal that would have solved it. Not conspiracies in the operatic sense. No cabal stroking cats in a thunderstorm. Just 1,000 administrative courtesies, adding up to a century that never quite happened the way the living remember it. I realized I had stopped reading with my eyes and started reading with my breath. When the light thinned toward evening, the pages exhaled what they could not carry into night. I inhaled by reflex. All men who have served at an altar learn to breathe on behalf of a room. It is a skill easily turned. "Sit," the watchman said softly, as though speaking to a fever. He placed before me a stack of aerographs, those thin, crystalline panes with writing that smokes when you lend them your warmth. "Look," he said, "not to thrill yourself, to understand the arithmetic. The first pane, a vow recorded, to excise 3 weeks from a year so calendars align with a dynasty's birthday. In exchange, grant the populace calmer dreams for a season. Reduce spontaneous uprisings by providential drizzle. In the corner, the price. 3 villages' memory of a flood that taught them to build on higher ground. It would be forgotten. They would rebuild too low. A century later, a minor catastrophe would be called an act of God when it was an act of accounting. The second pain. Agreement with a guild of printers nest the gospel of a woman among apocrypha. Distribute 3 scholarly editions in languages no nurse will read. Celebrate a saint who washed feet, but not a woman who taught hands to clean. Cost. 2 generations of mothers instructed to call observation disobedience. A science delayed but not destroyed. The delay profitable to relic sellers and to certain bishops fond of public weeping. Benefits. A rise in pilgrimage trade. A new hymn. A painting commissioned to improve morale. The ledger wore civility the way a blade wears reflection. Who buys? I asked, revolted by my own curiosity. Everyone, the watchman said. Kings, yes, popes, often, but also parishes, villages, universities. A town in need of donors will purchase a miracle rather than a well. A family will pay to rename a shame. A musician will trade 6 dissonances for a melody no one will forget. The prices are not consistent, only reliable. We call this mercy. Others call it control. The ledger does not argue, it totals. I wanted to know how much a soul cost, but could not stand to hear the number said with such bookkeeping calm. Instead, I asked about the clocks. He pointed to the wall where narrow faces ticked with a professional's courtesy. We run several, he said, to give the world options in retrospect. Who decides which one wins the retrospective? I pressed. The living, he said. And then, after a breath, the length of an unconfessed lie. And those who manage their memories. On the far shelf, a series of bound portfolios lay like geologic layers. Mirrors for princes, not the famous manual, but a family of sub-manuals, tailored for cardinals, abbesses, rectors, and archivists. I opened Mirror for an archivist and read rules written in a tone so tender I could have wept. When a document contradicts a life, save the life if you can. If you cannot, save the document, but veil it in a kindness of miscataloguing. When in doubt, choose the index entry that the poor will find first. I looked up, astonished. The watchman smiled without humor. Even tyrannies prefer to think of themselves as prudent charities, he said. A drawer labeled CHANS held links of varying weights and lengths. Each tag described a temperament for stubborn volumes, iron softened by missionary sweat. For skittish folios, silver from a chalice that cracked at Epiphany soothes fuss. For living pamphlets, disguised as ephemera, silk twisted round, let them believe themselves free. I ran my fingers along the metal and felt, absurdly, that the chains pitied me. Toward the room's center, the round table with pinpricks beckoned like a patient vice. One recognizably human object lay upon it. A large brass astrolabe whose plates had been scored and rescored until the sky must have grown weary of its appointments. Not a navigational toy. It was a calendar for griefs. Etched around the rim were the names of feast days, solstices, coronations, famines, and 3 words I could not translate. The watchman turned the reed. A delicate overlay of star pointers and panels beneath clicked into new alignments. Down in the wood, one of the pinpricks answered by rising. You could have hung a thread from it. He anchored a strand of crimson silk there, and then stretched it to another awakened pin. A figure took shape, not a constellation so much as a set of tensions. We string the year when it threatens to unravel, he said. Then we tighten the strings until the music changes key. What is the cost? I asked, because the question, by now, asked itself. He showed me a ledger tucked in a nook like a herb, kept away from harsh light. Tensioning a year to avoid revolt. Price paid by citizens in sleeplessness, adjusted across 6 weeks. 3 industrial accidents occurring on days previously safe. 1 opera rewritten to favor resignation over rage. And a decline in infant fevers for a fortnight as mercy. We balance, he said, almost pleading. And for a moment I pitied him, though the pity made me worse. And if no one tightened the strings, I said, then the music might be true, he said softly, and the cost incalculable. His tone hollowed the floor under me. I reached for something steady and found a slim volume that pretended to be trivial. Errata of the Holy Years. An index of small corrections. The year a plague was counted from the wrong equinox, with all attendant indulgence tables amended. A pilgrimage that arrived before the saint's bones due to a shipping mishap, with the miracle reassigned to a wind that hindered the boat. The feast that wandered into Lent by editorial drift and had to be coaxed back like a calf through a gate. Each fix annotated with a calculation. Parish morale improved, outcry negligible. Scholastic debate redirected into safe culverts. The writing was immaculate, no blame, only process. The poor remember the weather, I said aloud, repeating the lone refusal I had found in the padded tone. They do, the watchman agreed. Which is why we do not tamper with storms when we can help it. We move calendars around them. We are considerate. The words stung. Considerate. As if history were a dinner party and we were draping a cloth over the broken chair. I should tell you I considered leaving then. I did. I pictured packing the smallest bag, writing the longest letter, walking until sidewalks become roads, and roads become paths, and paths become dirt, willing to forget my name. But I am faithful to forms, and the form of duty held me where freighted wonder would have sent me running. Also, this is the part I'd rather omit. I was learning to enjoy the competence. Nothing is more dangerous than to be very good at something that should not exist. The day's assignment arrived folded like a surgical towel. I was to reconcile the dates of an obscure synod with the sightings of a comet recorded by shepherds who had no interest in doctrine but a superb regard for the sky. The shepherds' notes were clean, their ink modest, their margin drawings of sheep better than many frescoes. The synod minutes listed adjournments, meals, and the eventual triumph of a moderate position that managed to be more binding than any extremity would have dared. The comet was off by 6 days. My task, bring the universe into communion with the minutes. Isn't that large? I asked stupidly. It is delicate, the watchman said. Large things can be delicate. We will not move stars. We will move the record of who noticed them first. It is enough. End quote. So I set to work. I paged through the shepherd's ledger, their initials, their meticulous sky, a child's attempt to draw the tail of the comet with wet fingers. I paged through the synod minutes, their draftsman's pride, their finality. I found a detail the minutes would not miss. A procession on the 3rd day through streets lined with sellers of pears. Pears rotted, dates calciumed into place. We rephrased pears as summer fruit available early this year by grace, then footnoted a late frost. We moved their procession 3 days earlier for meteorological reasons, and amended the closing hymn to one more suitable for wind. I wrote like a coward and a surgeon. The comet's first notice now corresponded with the dignified deliberations of bishops who never looked up. "What have we purchased?" I asked. "Stomach sour with skill. A peace," the watchman said. "A little peace, and a line of sight that flatters men whose votes matter. It will spare some boy a crisis that would have eaten him." "And we have sold?" He paused. "We have sold the shepherds, a story in which their eyesight was unseasonable." It was the first time I heard regret file a corner off his voice. By then the room had taught me 3 laws no catechism had dared. Every calendar is a treaty. Every map lies with the permission of the people who want to arrive on time. Every correction leaves a fingerprint of what it could not quite erase. I traced those fingerprints like a policeman haunted by a case he refuses to solve. Here a smudge shaped like a woman's initial, where a midwife's ledger had been folded into a miracle, and the method filed under delicate. There a pick at the edge of a page, where a queen's title had been expanded by the addition of an impossible aunt. The world was full of gracious edits. I wanted to salt every margin until nothing would grow but the truth. "Do you still pray?" I asked the watchman in a voice that surprised me. "I try to bless what can be blessed," he said. "The rest I file toward the day a braver generation will retrieve it." "You think that day will come?" He looked at the nameless clock. "Clocks do not predict, they excuse." A small incident turned my attention from the noble to the petty, and back again. A pamphlet, not chained, skittered across the floor with the theatrics of a fish out of water. "Edifying Tales for Choir Boys," its cover promised, printed in cheap ink that smelled like Saturday. When I stooped to rescue it, a second cover peeled away like a sunburn, revealing a hand-stitched booklet titled "Methods to Keep Time Honest." The tales were a disguise. Inside, diagrams for sundials that refuse to be fooled by bureaucrats. Instructions for teachers to seed children's songs with the true length of noon. Directions for peasants to observe stars without being noticed doing so. Each page concluded with a plea in italics. "Sing this soft." At the back, a note in a woman's hand. "Hide me in stories. They search only for facts." I stood very still and understood that the room I served was not the only craft at sea. "Who wrote this?" I whispered. "We do not record their names," the watchman said, and I could not tell if he was protecting them or protecting the ledger from a contagion. I slid the booklet under my robe as if smuggling warmth. The theft made me feel young, then responsible. Later, when I would run, that booklet would be the only paper that did not try to weigh me. By closing, the shelves had curved another degree, or perhaps my spine had. The round table's pinpricks relaxed. The astrolabe settled, its ret purring like a cat that has been allowed to tell a secret and will not be punished for it. I reached to extinguish the lantern, and, in that small dusk, saw something I had missed. A narrow drawer built into the table's rim, thin as a lie told to a child. It slid open at a touch. Inside, a single object lay on black felt, a sliver of glass, cloudy, etched with scratches that were not scratches, but letters from an alphabet earlier than our alphabets learned to be beautiful. I breathed on it, and words assembled in the fog the way names appear on mirrors when children play at haunting. "When the day is too heavy to move," the letters said, "remove the smallest stone from its pocket." The fog faded. The glass became rude again. I thought of calendars with their pockets, of years with their lint, of burdens that can be lightened only by theft tiny enough to pass for oversight. "What is it?" I asked, already grieving that the answer would be practical. "A license," the watchman said. "Limited use. It lets us change nothing by changing very little." He took the shard from me with a tenderness that shamed me and slid it back until the drawer closed, with a click like a clause finding its verb. We left the vault quietly. When the door shut, my ears told me time had resumed an arrangement more familiar and less true. On the stairs, we passed a boy carrying cups of tea, his face raw with the pride of being trusted with heat. He had ink on his thumb, the red that never dries. I wanted to wipe it off with the corner of my robe as a mother would. Instead, I nodded like a man learning to accept the world's stains as uniform. Up in the corridor, the saints watched with bronze patience. Their eyes, melted into placid ovals by design, had seen less than the paper below them. That fact used to comfort me. It now felt like a betrayal. The statues had been built to look past the work of men. I returned to my cell and tried to sleep. The dream that found me was not dramatic. It was administrative. I was in the room of shelves that curved time, and every book I touched corrected my posture. I signed for a constellated key. I returned a shepherd's sky unopened. I asked the nameless clock whether it preferred honesty or harmony, and it wrote both with the minute hand and neither with the hour. When I woke, the street outside was deciding whether morning meant hope or procession. I went to the window and watched the city fail, beautifully, to choose. I wrote a sentence on the sill because wood forgives more quickly than paper. Every calendar is a treaty. I underlined it and hated the drama of the line. Then I went downstairs for coffee strong enough to remind a man he has a tongue. In the refectory, Brother Domenico, older again by a week, that was not a week, asked whether I had slept. "Enough to pay interest," I said. He smiled in that tired way only men who guard doors no one admits exist can smile. "Today," he said, "you will be asked to carry the harmonies." "What are they?" I asked. "Music for mismatched centuries," he said, and for the first time since I arrived, his voice betrayed a love for something more than procedure. "Bring them carefully. They are heavier than they sound." I carried them. Their weight negotiated my bones. And as I crossed the threshold into the room that curves time, the shelves bowed, almost imperceptibly, toward me, as if the world itself had developed at last the manners to nod. They do not call it a marketplace. Markets require daylight and the sound of haggling to justify themselves. Down here, the buying and selling are performed under the courtesy of lamps and the grammar of ledgers. The room, where memory is priced, has no windows and 3 doors, each pretending to be the only door that matters. The first is for clerks, the second is for penitents, the third is for men like me, who do not yet know which door they deserve. A sign above the central lectern reads, with terrifying moderation, "Valuation." The furniture is intimate, the kind used for weddings and wills. On the walls, no paintings, only mirrors with their silver bruised so they never quite admit you. The mirrors are not for vanity, they are for calibration. A memory weighed under a mirror loses less blood. "Remove your ring," the watchman said, and I realized I had slipped on the simple gold band I wore before vows of a different sort claimed my fingers. I placed it on the table, the way a man places a child on a doctor's scale, and hopes statistics will be kind. The archivist in charge of the room, an elegant woman with the composure of someone who has trained grief to wear shoes, nodded at my nervousness only once. Then she lifted a glass pane from a velvet tray. The writing on it smoldered faintly, as if ashamed to be legible. An aerograph, she said in the tone museums use, to name objects that have cost donors more than they will ever confess to a spouse. We will begin with observation. No exchange. Touch only with the breath. I breathed, and words formed where fog had learned the alphabet. A vow. 1 hour of untroubled sleep, purchased for a mother of 3 during the fever year. Price tendered. The taste of cinnamon from her childhood winters. Terms: permanent, gentle, non-lethal. The pane listed countersigns, witnesses, and a notation. Approved in mercy, collected in quiet. Who would take such a thing? I asked, nauseated by how reasonable it seemed. No one takes, the archivist corrected. We accept what is offered. In famine, people will trade softness for bread. In confusion, they will trade certainty for sleep. She returned the pane and selected another. A novice trades his first doubt for an extra year to an ailing mentor. Effect: the mentor finishes a translation that spares a nation a war with its own scriptures. Side effect: the novice cannot recognize good questions until middle age. The ledger returns interest then. The glass warmed under my breath. The words shivered. A boy I once knew put his hand up too late in a classroom and learned to stop trying. How did you learn to weigh what cannot be held? I asked. Watch, she said, and placed on the felt 2 balances, one that could measure a whisper, one that could measure a funeral. She set an index card on the first, the smell of old paper in a childhood library. The arm dipped delicately. She set a second card on the other, the night a father did not come home. The heavy balance bowed and stayed bowing. Some memories are capacious, she said. They admit other memories into themselves. Some are sovereign. They rule without allies. We calculate resonance across both. It should have been grotesque. It felt like a lesson in physics. At a side table, 2 clerks recorded valuations in a ledger that wore its humility like a disguise. The columns were crisp. Name, oblation, weight, rate, term, collection. No skulls, no candles, sputtering theatrically. Only the pen's quiet insistence that language can make anything seem proportionate. I read until the words dented my breathing. A painter offers 5 afternoons of astonishment for the certainty that his murals will not be whitewashed before he dies. Price accepted. 5 afternoons will be pleasant but dull. The murals will last. Children will prefer the colors to the subjects. A generation will learn the shape of mercy from blue. A small town, drought-struck, purchases 3 weeks of rain stories to keep hope alive until the canal is finished. Cost: 2 accurate diaries rewritten as parables. Future historians will call it folklore. The canal will be credited to Providence rather than tax reform. The town will be ruled by men who prefer prayer to budgets. A priest my handwriting. My name pledges to defend truth above institution. Price levied by the ledger without my consent. Grant him fervor, collect naivete. Term: 20 years. Renewal automatic unless wisdom intervenes. The entry had been stamped PAD in that red that never quite dries. I did not faint. I did not even sit. I did what all trained men do. I filed the horror under later and carried on breathing. "You will hate us if you stay long," the archivist said. "If you leave, you will hate yourself. The work is cruel either way, but cruelty is not its aim." "What is its aim?" I asked. "To keep the world from cracking where it has no business cracking," she said, "and to crack it where it must." She brought out a narrow drawer filled with slips, thinner than any paper I'd ever seen. "These are rescissions," she said. "Revocations. Sometimes we return what was taken, if the world will hold it again. What qualifies?" My voice sounded like a man speaking in a tiled bathroom, reluctant to hear himself. "Courage," she said. "Curiosity. A child's untaught tenderness. We are allowed, once in a while, to restore what fear borrowed." She handed me one. It was blank until I breathed on it. Then the sentence appeared: "Restore to Maria F. the memory of her sister's laugh, withheld to keep her from despair after the siege. Condition: return despair's mercy, but not its lie that love cannot survive." The pain cooled. My throat closed around the idea that an entire life might pivot because a piece of laughter came home. "Who writes these?" I asked again, hungry for one name I could love without negotiation. "Some of us," she said, nodding toward the clerks. "Some of your saints. Some people you would not expect to understand ratios, but do." From the far door came a sound like coins refusing a purse. The bellwoman entered carrying a tray of stamped discs, not money but the idea of money placeholders for contracts pending a vote. She set them on the table, counted them, and hummed a chord that soothed the room's temperature. 3 reversals, she said. 2 delays. 1 emergency. The word emergency changed the air. The archivist lifted a sealed envelope that had been hand-addressed in a script honest as rain. She broke the wax with a thumbnail, unfolded the letter, and read aloud a habit they had, reading aloud when they wanted to persuade a room to share responsibility for an act that would mark it. "A coastal city requests the erasure of 1 hour from an upcoming night to avoid the tide that will drown its poorest quarter. Offer. We will surrender the hour from our mornings for a year. We will be late together. We will accept the ridicule of punctual men. We will not accept the drowning." It was signed by names that looked like nets, interlaced, strong, poor. The watchman's eyes closed and opened once, slow as a bruise. "We can move the hour," the archivist said, "but the tide will still insist upon the moon. We can redirect that insistence." "At what price?" I asked, and hated myself for sounding like a cashier of grief. "Songs," she said. "Years from now their music will lean flat by a degree. Their laughter will be a hair late. The city will be saved. Audiences will not know why a soprano slightly misses the note that carries the room." Her face did something precarious, and then steadied. "We do it often. It is one of the few adjustments that harms no one beyond a certain ache." "And the hour?" I pressed. "They will lose it from their mornings," she said. "They will adapt. The ridicule will be instructive. I signed as witness because the room requested it, and because saying no down here is like trying to stop water with a palm." The discs rang softly as they were replaced, one for each council that needed to approve the revision, one for the organist who would alter the hymns, so the congregation could forgive a key that never quite found itself. While the clerks prepared the act, the watchman ushered me to a side cabinet I had not yet seen. It held what looked like jewelry chains again, yes, but finer, slighter, more intimate. Each hung from a tag inscribed with a quality: boldness, tenderness, suspicion, patience, wonder. Not emotions, those are storms. These were virtues in their work clothes. You chain books, I said. You will chain these too? We bind them to objects that can carry them safely, he said. The world cannot bear raw virtues in quantity. They clot or flood, so we anchor them. He lifted wonder and fastened it, with a gesture like blessing, around a child's wooden top. Spin this in a classroom, he said, and it will purchase 3 questions the teacher would otherwise have hurried past. He set suspicion on a shepherd's staff. Lean on this in a council meeting, and you will notice the page nobody else is reading. He clipped tenderness to a baker's paddle. Bread will taste like company. It was absurd. It was beautiful. It was wrong, and it was right. That is the texture of the room. A cloth woven from contradictions you are asked to wear to dinner. I turned and saw, half hidden behind the cabinet, a narrow jamb with a seal. I recognized the blank one that throws your face back at you. The door was only shoulder wide. The watchman did not move to block it. He only adjusted the lantern as though one would need one's hands free. Where does that go? I asked, already sure I knew. To the account we keep for those who sign without reading, he said gently. We call it the Hall of Mispriced Things. He allowed me a glance. Inside, shelves of oddments. A violin with 1 string tuned to grief and 3 to gratitude. A pair of spectacles that make scripture look like ledger lines and ledger lines look like sea. A small wooden box labeled for a widow who purchased silence thinking it was peace. The box was empty except for a folded slip, reopen when ready. A stack of unmailed letters bound with twine that had worn a prayer into itself. A key that opened nothing but made doors more likely to be kind. I backed out as if returning from a coffin and collided with something softer than wood. A boy stood in the doorway of the main room, holding 2 cups of mint tea and trying very hard not to be noticed. He had the round ears of a child not yet disillusioned, and the smudged thumb of a clerk in training. He caught my look and lifted 1 cup like an offering. For you, Father, he said. He called me Father because I looked like one on paper. Thank you, I said, and the archivist, hearing the exchange, smiled in that sideways way professionals smile when the world looks briefly like home. Hold the cup, she said to me when the boy had gone. Tell me what you remember. I remembered mint in a courtyard long ago, and a seminarian with a laugh like a hinge that refuses rust, and the day we stole a nap in a library we'd locked with a hook fashioned from a bent spoon. I remembered the heat of summer, on tile, and the certainty that I would never know the ledgered price of my own heart. She nodded. Now hold it with your left hand. The memory shifted. Not much. Just enough to admit a shadow at the edge of the courtyard, someone watching, someone recording. She wrote a tiny notation. Left hand weakens associations. Do not pour with left when pricing grief. It introduces superstition. In the ledger, 1 more column of the world learned to imitate mathematics. How often do you refuse a purchase? I asked. Less often than we want, she said. More often than our superiors think. We decline exchanges that would make the poor pay twice. We do not let men buy fame with their children's astonishment. We charge penalties when an institution attempts to purchase a revision that hides its cruelty but keeps its power. We are not without a conscience. We are only employed. And when you fail, she did not pretend not to understand. We build an index, she said, so a braver reader can someday find what we lacked the courage to retrieve. I thought of the thin booklet I had stolen, Methods to Keep Time Honest, and felt for a heartbeat useful. The emergency concluded with a sequence of signatures that looked like birds skimming a lake. The bellwoman hummed a final chord to settle the room's hinges. Somewhere far above us, a city's night dropped 1 hour into its morning, like a coin into a jar. Children coughed less. Songs leaned flat, just a whisper, just enough to be noticed by the sort of listener who keeps notebooks and regret. We called it mercy. We were not entirely wrong. And then came the moment I had been avoiding, which is to say the moment every confession cultivates in the dark. The discovery of my own contract, not as an entry in a ledger, but as a pain, set aside for a signature I did not remember writing. It lay in a shallow drawer with a name label like a doorbell. My name, precise as a grave. I breathed, and the letters rose, and there, etched in a hand that resembled mine but stood straighter, was a pledge. I will defend the truth above the institution. And beside it, in the room's small print, in exchange, remove his sweetness at the precise moments when sweetness would purchase escape. Grant him the stubbornness which is sometimes a virtue and more often a lock. Term, renewable by exhaustion. The counter-signature belonged to a man I had respected. He had witnessed my valor and found a use for it. I felt anger, relief, embarrassment, the entire chemistry set of a man recognizing the shape of his cage. Who brought this? I asked. You did, the watchman said. The first month you came below, you wanted to be uncompromised. We provided an instrument. I don't remember. He nodded toward the mirrors. You gave us those hours. We spent them on your behalf. I felt then, with the clarity of a blade held under water, that I was not only a witness, I was inventory. Perhaps this is the point at which men shout. I did not. I placed my palms flat on the table and felt, through the wood, the small pulse of the world deciding to turn. The archivist watched me with the professional empathy of a midwife who has delivered both miracles and grief. You can rescind, she said softly. We offer rescissions when the arithmetic allows. What would be the price? I asked. Sweetness returns, she said. But you will doubt yourself when you most need to be stubborn. You will forgive too quickly. You will be kinder than is safe. Cames and rei, and then range anon. I laughed, which is to say, I showed my teeth. And the danger? You will love people who will not love you back, she said. It is an expensive habit. I did not sign. Not yet. Cowardice can look like prudence if the room flatters you. The watchman closed the drawer. There is a door, he said, as if changing the subject. It is not numbered. It is older than the others and pretends to be shy. We will go there soon. The 13th, I said. The way you say a catechism answer you don't fully understand. He inclined his head as if I had earned a lesson. Not 13th, he said. The door before numbers learned to count themselves important. Is not. We left the valuation room in a silence that was not sacred and not yet enforced, simply the silence of people who have seen arithmetic applied to breath. On the way out, I passed a small board, tacked with requests written in a hurry. Please return my grandmother's whistle. Please uncross out Lucia. Please give me back the question I asked when I was 7, and everyone laughed. None were stamped approved. None were stamped denied. They waited in that purgatory clerk's call pending and saints' call prayer. I climbed one turn of the stairs and felt the city above me continue without me, a relief, a betrayal. In my cell, I poured the mint tea the boy had given me into the basin and watched the steam draw question marks on the mirror. I thought of the violin with its grief string, of the spectacles that turned scripture into ledger and ledger into sea, of a city whose songs would lean flat and whose toddlers would live to ask why, of a woman named Maria somewhere holding the laugh of her sister as if it were a bird that had found the window at last. Then, because confession means inventory, I made a list on the sill, what I have held in my hands that I cannot justify, what I have refused to sign that will cost someone I will never meet, what I will steal when the door opens again, what I will return if given the courage to pay. The pencil scratched like a small animal, insisting on its one available tunnel. I slept with my hands open on the blanket the way children do when they've forgiven the day. In my dream, the mirrors in the valuation room refused to show my face, and instead offered possibilities, one where I rescinded and loved unwisely. One where I kept my clever lock and died admired by men who forget names. One where I broke something so large it made a sound like weather. I woke before choosing, which is the coward's mercy. When I went below the next evening, the watchman was waiting with a key that looked, as always, like a star who had been punished. He held it lightly between finger and thumb, the way a man handles a truth he cannot improve. "It is time," he said. "For the door?" I asked. "For the price list," he said. And then the door. He led me past the valuation room, past the chains with their gentle tags, past the astrolabe that tuned the year into obedience. We stopped at a case the size of a cradle. Inside, thinner than a parish newsletter and twice as dangerous, lay a pamphlet bound in thread blacker than any ink. The title was small and apologetic, "A Price List of a Human Soul." "Read," he said. I did, and the pages rearranged the air. They were not grand, they were domestic. One unasked question worth a night of easy sleep. 3 unasked questions worth a promotion in a system that rewards obedience. A decade of curiosity worth exile among people who still remember storms. A lifetime of stubborn remembering priceless, therefore punishable. The last line was a joke that did not laugh. I looked up. The watchman did not smile. The key in his hand did not glitter. Somewhere, a clock without a name adjusted its hands like a man rolling his shoulders before a task he has performed too often. "You still want to open it," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said, because lying in rooms lined with ledgers is like singing off-key to a God who owns every note. "Then understand," he said, and for the first time his voice held the warmth of a person rather than a profession, that doors do not open in one direction alone. He handed me the key. It was cold and then unbearably human warm. I closed my fingers over the humiliated star and felt, in the same heartbeat, how cheaply I had priced my own endurance and how expensive the next breath was going to be. We turned toward the corridor where numbers had never been taught to boast. The lamps lowered themselves the way candles bow to a procession. The shelves along the walls curved so gently they seemed to be pretending not to notice us. "Walk," the watchman said. "Do not look back. The room dislikes nostalgia. It expects payment." I walked. My feet negotiated the incline as if time itself were a river I had decided, too late, to wade. Ahead, the curtain woven with sigils that rearranged themselves to greet each reader quivered like a held breath. Behind it, the door waited the way a confession waits, not to be opened, but to be uttered. The corridor that leads to the door without a number pretends to be smaller than it is. That is its first kindness. The second is the curtain embroidered with sigils that refuse to hold still, as if letters from an alphabet too early for ours were changing their minds about what to mean. The watchman stood behind me at a distance appropriate for baptism and execution. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The key in my palm star filed blunt until it looked like shame warmed, then cooled, then settled at a temperature that reminded me of a forehead under a worried hand. The curtain did not rustle. It recoiled, like water making way for a boat that knows the river. Behind it, a door of undecorated wood, the kind used in convent kitchens where all miracles are practical. No number. No date. No plaque stamped with the M dash that passed for ancient punctuation down here. Only the grain, which ran against itself, like two histories disagreeing politely. "Do not knock," the watchman said. "I wasn't going to." "You were," he said, "and perhaps I was." The key entered the lock, as if it had been called home. The door opened inward, then backward, then both, like a gesture improvised by a careful liar. I had prepared myself for a vault of thunder or a chapel devoted to the geometry of cruelty. I was not prepared for a woman's dressing room. That is not what it was. Not literally, but that's what it felt like. A narrow space with a long mirror, angled to flatter, a bench of gentle wood, the smell of old powder that might have been vellum dust remembering skin. The mirror's silver had tarnished in a pattern that looked like a storm learning to be a map. When I breathed, my reflection appeared, then blurred, then arranged itself in vestments I had never owned. I have said already that the room below is not theatrical. This one was. Not in the sense that it wanted an audience, but in the sense that it wanted to be honest about how easily humans are moved by frames and light. The mirror did not show me monsters. It showed me edits. The first was domestic. A kitchen, a calendar, a woman moving a feast day with a pencil because flour arrived late that year and she didn't want to starve the joy. A little girl learned the song on the new date and never knew the old. The mirror wrote beneath the scene, "Permissible drift." I almost smiled. Then the kitchen dissolved and the pencil became a quill in a clerk's hand moving a council 3 weeks to catch a comet, and I did not smile. A page of scripture arranged itself, familiar but wrong. The margin notes were names, not saints, not prophets, editors. They appeared and vanished with the modest confidence of men unaccustomed to windows that faced streets. The mirror let me read, a woman's voice smothered by a later paragraph. It did not purport to shock me with blood. It preferred footnotes. The room trusted that I had learned to fear footnotes more than knives. Then the mirror brightened, the way a lake brightens when a cloud decides to bless a fisherman, and I saw what I had been promised only in rumor. The harmonic gospel, not a text, a table. Columns for original phrasing. Columns for harmonies introduced to keep contradictions from sounding like arguments. Another column of names, women's names this time crossed out, then restored, then crossed out again. The ledger unable to settle. I pressed my finger to the glass and the tarnish warmed, as if the silver remembered heat from another hand that had tried. An attempt at restoration is a confession, the mirror wrote. The letters smeared and reformed. There are revelations that ask to be shouted. There are those that request a witness who can read aloud without weeping. This asked for neither. It wanted a signature, one irrevocable truth for one unrepeatable memory, said the line that appeared next, in a hand I recognized from the canon of lost days. Not a bargain, a rate. The mirror offered 3 boxes, each the size of a fingernail. Sight, hearing, taste. Choose a sense for the truth to occupy, I understood. Choose a sense for the memory to vacate. Not a soul, I whispered. A soul is an account, the watchman said. This is a line item. What if I refuse? You can, he said. The door will not sulk, but you will always suspect yourself of cowardice, and suspicion is more expensive than truth. I stared at the boxes until they blurred. My mind, so proud of its sentences, offered nothing but scenes. The taste of rain, my mother taught me a wordless tuition, conducted with a palm held out of a window, a little laugh at the petrichor's penny metal bite, the sound of a boy's question in a back pew, the one that made his father flinch and his grandmother bless herself with the wrong hand, the sight of a saint's statue with a chipped toe. These were not artifacts, they were hinges. Choose, the mirror wrote, without punctuation, as if grammar would make the choice easier to lie about. I chose. I will not tell you which. I have already lost enough privacy to inventories. When my finger touched the selected box, the glass chilled as if a sea had said no. Then it warmed and something left me, like a bird that has waited all winter for a generous window. The mirror did not congratulate me. It does not belong to parents. It belongs to clerks. It gave me the truth I had purchased, with the same polite efficiency with which it had removed my memory. They did not only revise the past, it wrote, they collared the future. The letters brightened until they felt muscular, then softened as if exhausted by their own courage. Around them, cross-references multiplied, flitting like moths that had learned to be useful. A comet's tail slid backward along a timeline to kiss a coronation. A queen acquired an aunt whose title justified an annexation that had never been popular after harvest. A city whose poor quarter would have drowned had its tide laid flat across an hour that disappeared into a morning, and in return its music leaned by a fraction, and a child who might have become a soprano became a fisherman with a good hand at nets. Mercy, the mirror added, and I wanted to argue, and I wanted to agree, and I wanted to write a different word that began with the same mouth. Names arrived, the catalogue of doppelpopes, a ledger of stand-ins and interim mouths. Not fraud, the mirror said. Insurance. There are moments when the body that wears the ring cannot be there to ring. The interim hand signs, speaks, absolves, condemns. The debt is reconciled later by liturgy. A footnote recommended a prayer for those who have impersonated sanctity without consent. What do you want me to do with this? I asked the watchman. The mirror answered instead. Remember. It is a verb I had thought noble until this room priced it at more than I could afford. Beyond the mirror, a small desk revealed itself in the reflection, the trick of light a stagehand would admire. In the real room there was nothing. In the glass, drawers waited. One opened when I looked. Inside lay a booklet, plain as liturgy, a price list of a human soul. I had read it in the valuation room. This copy wore additions in my handwriting. One question asked in public worth a career in a minor exile where good men become careful. 4 questions asked at the wrong funerals worth a town that decides to stop inviting you to stand near the casket. A lifetime of stubborn remembering priceless, therefore punishable. Someone, me, not me, had underlined therefore until the paper slickened. I reached for the booklet and touched glass. The mirror offered an aperture the size of a page. If I wanted it, I would have to tear. My hand disobeyed my awe and obeyed my hunger. The page came away not with a scream but with a sound like a glove removed before an operation. The room's temperature changed. Somewhere to my left, a chord resolved without permission. Behind me, far away and suddenly near, the bellwoman's hum sharpened into warning. "Return it," the watchman said. He was at the curtain now, not in the doorway. His voice was still the voice of a professional, but it had acquired the frightened love a custodian feels for a building that has kept people alive through storms. "No," I said, "because there are little syllables that are prayers, if you say them like one." "The market must balance," he said. "No," I said again, and that made it easier to breathe. The mirror showed me myself, not as I was, but as I would be if I stayed. The vestments I had never owned hung correctly. The ring I had taken off gleamed like an opinion. My hands held the instruments. I would become no. I had already become the sort of man who could weigh a mother's cinnamon against 3 children's sleep and call the result equitable. The mirror did not judge. It reported, "It has never been anyone's job to excuse mirrors. Light made itself narrow." The door behind me, kitchenwood, honest and wrong, shivered like a creature that has tolerated too much training. The archivist's footsteps arrived, were careful, and stopped. "Do not let him leave with it," she said softly, and there was grief in it, not rage. "We will pay for that page where we cannot afford to." "You will pay everywhere," I said, "if you call memory a currency." "Memory is a power," she said. "Powers must be priced, or they devour the poor first." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the alternative to this ledger is not justice but fire. I had no assurance to offer the room, only refusal. I folded the page and placed it inside my shirt. Where men keep letters, and women keep prayers, and soldiers keep photographs they cannot bear to look at yet. The watchman did not move to take it. He had long ago accepted that some thefts are part of the budget. "Walk out," he said, "or the room will keep you. Will you stop me?" He regarded the mirror as if it could adjudicate between love and duty. "I will try," he said, "not to help you." I moved. The curtain's sigils flared like accusations and then arranged themselves into a sentence that read, inelegantly, "The door remembers who owes." I lifted the humiliated star of a key and locked the kitchen wood door as if locking would matter. Locks are spells. They comfort the hand, not the future. The corridor lengthened the way the drunk lengthens a song. Time put its tongue on the roof of its mouth and held. When motion returned, it returned all at once. Lamps brightened for pursuit. Shadows stood up and practiced being men. The shelves along the wall leaned another degree toward me, as if the room wished me well against its own doctrine. At the first landing, the Nameless clock performed a courtesy. It loosened its grip on the minute, giving me 3 that did not belong to me. They tasted like iron. At the second landing, the bellwoman's hum, written in air, became a line my feet could walk. It led to a stair none of my maps admitted service, narrow, the sort of riser built for feet that remember where they're going because eyes cannot help. Left, breathed the watchman from far behind, and I turned right out of habit and found myself walking through a wall that had decided to be polite. You expect alarms to be cruel. The worst are decorous. The ledger prefers to notice you with a notation that reads, "Retrieval in progress," rather than with shouting. The shouting arrived later, from my own ribs. At the top, sunlight had not been briefed. It sat on stones with the smug innocence of a cat in a monastery. It made no effort to approve or disapprove of me. Bells were deciding between the hour and mercy. I stepped out into the courtyard that isn't on postcards, and the air, unpriced for now, remembered birds. The watchman reached me, not running. Professionals never run where novices might see them. His face wore the look of a man late for a wedding he doesn't believe in but hopes will turn out for the best. He held out his hand, not for the page, for the key. "Give it," he said. "Why?" "So you will have at least one clean exit," he said. "Keys left in pockets eat their owners." He was not lying. I placed the star without points on his palm and felt the odd gratitude of a man who has finally trusted someone to carry a weapon he cannot. He closed his fingers and opened them again. The key did not take. It hovered, not afloat in indecision. It looked at the sky as if measuring calendar options. Then it rose a finger's breadth and stopped. The watchman did not attempt to catch it. "It knows you are not done," he said. "Will it follow?" "It will wait. It has more patience than either of us." The archivist arrived, not breathless. She took in the courtyard, the key, my hands. There was very little drama available for any of us to use. The house had absorbed it. "You have taken a page," she said. "I have," I said. "You intend to, what, publish it?" The word was kind. People forget that to publish is to make public, a verb that used to be a prayer. "No," I said. "I intend to remember it where no one can buy it." "That is not a location," she murmured. "I'll make it one," I said, and I believed myself because I needed to. The watchman glanced toward the shadow of a tower, where a statue of a saint without eyes pointed at a road that had been moved 2 degrees to flatter a palace. "Go," he said, as if releasing a bird that has not yet forgiven the hand that fed it. "To where?" "To the day," he said. "You have owed it attention for longer than you think." Down the outer stairs the city went on with the gall of the living. Tourists misnamed fountains and were baptized by laughter. A scooter coughed theology from a poor muffler. Somewhere a baker's tenderness was chained to a paddle and bread tasted like company. I held my breastbone, as if the page could learn my heartbeat and be loyal to it. I did not feel triumphant. I felt like a clerk who has stolen the tiniest stamp and knows the entire mail will be late by a whisper. Perhaps that whisper is enough. Perhaps it is a draft that lets a door decide to be a window. Perhaps I have robbed a city of a chord it needed, and must someday pay interest in a voice that cracks where it should have flown. At the edge of the square, a woman sold little top spinners to children, the cheap wooden kind that wobble themselves into competence. One lay in her tray with a silk thread tied round it, color of old roses, wonder. I recognized the chain by the archivist's handwriting on a tag I could not see but knew was there. A child bought it, spun it once, laughed, and asked his mother 3 questions in a row. The mother answered 2, and saved 1 for later. I could have wept from the practical mercy of it. I leaned in a doorway, not meant for leaning, and read the page again, the one I had stolen, even though I did not need to. It knew me now. It would not make me beg. The lines were the same and not. 1 unasked question worth a night of easy sleep. 3 worth a promotion inside a system that gets better at not hearing itself. A lifetime of stubborn remembering priceless, therefore punishable. The last word had learned under my skin to pronounce itself as vow. Behind me, in that underground where clocks had been trained to vote, something adjusted. I felt it in my teeth. The key in the courtyard hung at its finger's breadth, and would, I knew now, remain there until I taught another hand to hold it. Such objects refuse singular custody. They belong to verbs. I walked, not away, but along through streets that remember water by the curve of their stones, past a church where a hymnal had been domesticated into lullaby, toward a fence where ivy practiced its patient theft of walls. The city would forgive me if I made a good story of it. The room below would not forgive anything, but it would file my defiance under anticipated leakage and go about its work until someone trained to be kinder than is safe arrived with better arithmetic. On a bench near an unphotographed fountain, I took a pencil and wrote on the stolen page small, in the margin, where clerks tuck their prayers, "Return, if possible, Lucia of the 3 mirrors. Restore, if you dare." The question a boy asked that made his father flinch. It was a superstition. The ledger is not swayed by pencil marks made outdoors, and yet the air around the words felt less obedient. The sun performed its obedience to the hour without asking the nameless clock for clearance. People who do not believe in the mercies of ledgers enjoyed oranges and shade as if both were inevitable. A dove stepped with the idiotic authority of birds in cities that have never learned modesty. I sat until my back ached, and my stubbornness clarified from posture into promise. I will not catalogue what memory I paid to pass the mirror. You would recognize its shape. You would mourn with me, and we would both be poorer. Let it remain a silhouette behind glass. The truth I bought costs less in the telling than it did in the taking. They did not only revise the past, they collared the future. They tuned the year like a violin with 1 string set to grief. They slanted laughter by a degree and called it balance. They priced questions not to silence us entirely, but to make our quiet profitable. I rose. The city accepted my standing as if it had been expecting it. Bells decided together that their purpose was not to scold but to remind. The road pointed where the blind saint pointed, which is to say toward whatever was courageous enough to be ordinary. Under my shirt, the paper warmed. Memory does that when it is asked to be brave. When I returned to my room, I wrote a sentence on the windowsill beside the others, and did not underline it because drama has its limits. Markets only balance when we agree on the currency. I no longer do. Then I slept for 1 hour that had not been bought or sold. When I woke, the mirror in my cell had fogged itself with a single word, written by no hand I could accuse. Soon. The 13th door, being older than numbers, does not close behind you. It remains ajar in the mind, like an injury you can walk on until the weather changes. The weather had changed. It was time to speak. It was time to teach the day its own name again. It was time to ask questions aloud, in the places where ledgers cannot invoice the echo. It was time to call you. You are awake or near enough. Perhaps your room is dark and kind. Perhaps a street lamp threads your curtains with a faint geometry. Perhaps you can hear a refrigerator singing its one-note hymn. Wherever you are, I have brought you as far below as a stranger's voice should. Now I have to ask you to climb with me not into a chapel, not into an argument, but into a word we use too easily. Remember, I did not run away with a trunk of relics. I did not torch a vault. I stole a page, which is to say, I stole a small, stubborn permission. If you've listened this long, you already know the shape of the ledger's appetite. It prices questions. It taxes wonder. It leases hours. It moves comets by moving men. It keeps the poor from drowning by charging their children a flattened cord. It is, in its way, merciful, mercilessly merciful. And yet, the morning after the door without a number taught me how a mirror can make a man choose. I walked the city as if streets were footnotes and fountains were citations. The key I tried to surrender hung above a courtyard like a star ashamed of itself. The archivist returned to her ledgers. The bellwoman tuned the day. The watchman filed my theft under anticipated leakage. Above ground, a child spun a wooden top chained to wonder. He asked his mother 3 questions in a row, and the world, temporarily, had the decency to be interesting. I tell you this because I have been accused of hating institutions. I do not. I hate forgetting that has learned to dress as order. I hate the way a century can be tidied until it no longer explains the scar it left on a village. I hate that we call silence a sacrament when it is so often an invoice. I hate the professional tone in my own throat. What I want, what I am asking for, is smaller and more unruly. The return of memory to the people who live inside it. You will be told that memory is untrustworthy. Yes, so are budgets and maps and the minutes of meetings where the vote was held after the dissenters went home. The ledger below counts on your fatigue. It requires your desire to be well behaved. It is not wrong to want a world that runs on time. It is fatal to pretend that time is innocent. I should tell you how to begin. Not with outrage. Outrage is a flare. It lights the field, and then burns out and leaves you night blind. Begin with inventory. Open a notebook. It can be paper or a notes app that refuses to sell your secrets. At the top of the first page, write, "Things I am told not to ask twice." Underline nothing. You will only encourage your drama. Then list. Write down the sentence that makes your teacher clear her throat. Write down the date your grandfather remembers and your textbook forgets. Write the name of the woman who taught you to wash your hands before she taught you to pray. Write the smell of the library from your childhood, and the day the library changed its hours to flatter a donor's ribbon cutting. Second page. Storms I remember that no one else does. If you are American, you will have plenty. If you are European, your streets already know cobbles remember water with a loyalty that embarrasses the stones. Do not romanticize your list. It is not a poem. It is a receipt. Third page. Questions that would be called impolite in a quiet room. Who edited this? Who profits? What hour did the city lose to save itself from drowning, and how will we give it back without charging the children for the note that went flat? I cannot promise anyone will read this ledger but you. I can promise it will make you unfit for certain meetings, which is, I believe, a promotion. You will need methods. The ones I smuggled out were stitched into a booklet disguised as Edifying Tales for Choir Boys. You will not find my copy, but you can rebuild it by a kind of neighborhood science. Plant in your classroom a top tide to wonder and spin it when the lesson becomes obedient. Teach your choir to sing a measure that refuses to lean flat, if only at home, while the kettle practices theology. Show your children constellations. But give the stars back their first names, the ones women whispered to each other across roofs while men were away inventing calendars that made kings old enough to matter. Tell them about Lucia of the Three Mirrors. Tell them she counted minutes, as if minutes were stitches, and fever a seam that could be unpicked. Tell them her name was crossed out in a book. Then speak it aloud. Names are stubborn. They survive on air. If you are a baker, chain tenderness to your paddle. If you are a shepherd, fasten suspicion to your staff so you will see the page nobody else is reading. If you are a city planner, refuse the miracle that lets donors rename a floodplain into a neighborhood with fashionable cafes. Give the river back its sulks. Build on higher ground and call it piety. If you attend a funeral and someone tries to move the eulogy 3 days earlier to catch a comet, say no. There will be no comet. That is not the point. Say no, because grief has a calendar that refuses to be harmonized by men who prefer their storms on Tuesdays. If you run a school, place in the hallway a map that is unafraid to be wrong in public. When the coastline shifts, draw the shift in chalk. Invite the children to argue with you. Tell them the map is not a parent, it is an instrument. Tune it as they learn to tune their own questions. If you keep an archive, write your index so the poor will find it first. When you are ordered to reclassify a woman's method as vision, keep 2 cards, one that obeys, one that remembers. Hide the second where the curious cannot help but notice. Curiosity is a homing instinct. It finds what cages forget to padlock. If you pray, bless what can be blessed. For the rest, build an index. There are rooms below us, catalogued in the language of mercy. There are rooms above ground, catalogued in the language of grant proposals. Between them is a staircase that would very much like you to believe it is neutral. Teach your feet suspicion, count the turns, write the dates that refuse ellipses. What of the day that doesn't occur? You will meet it. It slides into our calendars with the manners of an apology. Letters misdate themselves. Children become their father's older brothers for an hour. Recipes forget salt. Do not panic. Take out your notebook. Under felt, write everything unmathematical. The smell of rain in a room with no windows. The way your watch apologized by stopping. Under measured, write what can be counted. A clock 15 minutes kind to you. A bus that arrived before it left. When the day releases itself back into a week that can be discussed without embarrassment, the ledger below will look up, briefly, and wonder who taught you the format. Do not answer. Smile like a person with friends. You will want heroes. Do not appoint me. I was a priest on paper and a clerk by habit. I opened a door and did not close it. I stole a page, and I lost. No, traded an unrepeatable memory, so a truth could occupy the sense that now bears it. You will ask which memory. I will not say. I choose to believe It is waiting for me somewhere not given to ledgers. In a kitchen, perhaps, where a mother holds out her hand to teach the smell of rain, or in a back pew where a boy asks a question that makes his father flinch and his grandmother bless herself with the wrong hand. I will find it by living out loud near people who keep notebooks. You want villains. You will be disappointed. The watchman was kind when it cost nothing and honest when it did. The archivist kept the room's cruelty as small as the room allowed. The bellwoman tuned the day so it did not break under the weight of our edits. The clerks ate raisins like penance and wrote like metronomes. They believed they were keeping us from cracking where we had no business cracking. Sometimes they were right. Often they were merely on time. The ledger is not a dragon. It is a diet. It trims. It forbids seconds. It dislikes astonishment after midnight. It calls awe a stimulant and prescribes sleep. We need sleep. We do not need obedience. I promised a call. It will not sound like a trumpet. It will sound like the first sentence of a letter you have owed yourself for years. Do not stop asking questions. The market that prices memory is most terrified by questions that reproduce. One question in private is affordable. 3 questions asked in company are a deficit. A lifetime of stubborn remembering is, say it with me now, priceless, therefore punishable. Accept the punishment. Budget for it. Surround yourself with people who will feed you while you serve your short sentences in the small jails of reputation. To the Americans in the room, your country is a calendar written in pencil. Your storms arrive in election years and in kindergarten classrooms. You invent feasts out of sales. You rename floods. Your ledgers are app-based. Teach your children that the bell on the school wall and the bell in the church, steeple and the bell on the phone each have a theology. Ask whose sleep is being purchased when you silence one. To Europeans, your streets are maps your ancestors drew with their feet. Your archives have better lighting than your kitchens. You have perfected the art of moving a feast without admitting to the movement. You know how to polish the brass plaque that bears the M-date. Polish less, point more. The poor remember the weather. Put that line above your counsels, to both. Stop filing women under vision when they are doing method. Stop calling sanitation a miracle. Stop calling curiosity disobedience when it is a form of praise. Restore the names crossed out by habits that made men comfortable. Teach your saints to share their altars with midwives and mechanics. Paint angels who smell like yeast and solvent. If you must price anything, price cowardice high. Make it unaffordable. A practical exercise. Tomorrow, at breakfast, choose one sentence you have allowed to remain edited past decency. Restore it. It can be small. My mother taught me the smell of rain. Say it aloud in a room where someone you love can hear. Watch how the air rearranges itself around the truth. That is the opposite of a miracle. It is a method. At noon, find a clock near a public building and wait 3 minutes after it strikes. Listen to who arrives late and who arrives relieved. Ask yourself which music in your city leans flat by a whisper. Hear which industries prefer that pitch. Decide whether you will go along. By evening, pick a door. Not the 13th. Those belong to places and people who can afford mirrors. Pick an ordinary door that claims to be locked. Draw it on paper. Draw the key as a star without points. Tell a child this story and then let the child decide whether the door opens inward or backward or both. That child is your insurance against polite tyranny. And at night, when you are where you are now, almost asleep, nearly forgiven, recite this to yourself, as if it were an examen for a century that would like to be better behaved than the last. What did I accept because I was tired? What did I refuse because I was afraid? Which question will I ask tomorrow, even if it costs me a flat chord in a room that prefers harmony? Whom will I teach to spin wonder? What will I remember when I am asked to be profitable? You may be worrying that you are alone. You are not. Somewhere a top is spinning in a classroom that, for 1 minute, refuses to be obedient. Somewhere a baker is sneaking tenderness into bread. Somewhere a choir boy is humming a measure that straightens the spine of a hymn. Somewhere an archivist has filed an index card so cleverly that a girl will find it and will not mistake method for miracle. Somewhere Lucia of the Three Mirrors is being spoken aloud, and the fever out of respect decides to recede politely. And yes, somewhere a city's music leans flat because an hour went missing to save the poor from drowning. If you live there, sing a little sharp at home. Not enough to be rude, just enough to tell the ledger you heard what it did and you refuse to keep its pitch in your bones. I will finish as I began, with a confession. I wanted the ledger to be a monster so that my courage could be a sword. It is not a monster. It is a filing system. My courage is a notebook. I will write in it each night, irregularly, like weather. When I die, and I will, ledger or no, edit or none, I pray that someone will find my notes and recognize their own handwriting. I am told I should offer you absolution. I cannot. That is not my jurisdiction anymore, if it ever was. What I can offer is a key that refuses to fall. It will hover above any courtyard where people gather to decide whether to be kind or punctual. It belongs to verbs. If you need it, look up. If you cannot see it, draw one and teach your hands the shape of a star humbled into usefulness. That is how doors open in places that pretend they do not exist. Now sleep. Not the sleep purchased by forgetting, not the sleep that bills you in the morning. Sleep the way paper sleeps, quietly, full of fibers that refuse to agree on a single direction. When you wake, write one line on your windowsill. It can be this, if you like. The most dangerous thing to them is not outrage. It is the return of memory. Say it softly. Teach it to a friend. Whisper it to a child. Pin it to a bulletin board in a hallway that smells faintly of books. Fold it into your pocket and carry it into rooms that insist on harmony. Let it lean the note by a merciful degree. And when someone asks you, kindly, professionally, to stop asking, smile with your whole ordinary face and tell them what the mirror told me. We did not come here to be correct. We came here to remember.